All right, welcome to Content Slam 2 for World Order. Let's get straight into it. There are three things that students need to learn how to do in this one, and in fact, this is the one part of the entire legal study syllabus where students have to perform the most amount of mental gymnastics. So bear with me and I'll explain exactly how to do that. And there are three things that students need to be able to do. Examine the role of sovereignty in assisting and impeding the resolution of world order issues. Explain the role of the Australian federal government in responding to world order. But running throughout all of this is this issue down here, considered throughout these points and the content, is students need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of legal and non-legal measures in resolving conflict and working towards world order. So all three of these points, this point here, this point here, this point here, will be achieved by looking at the single set of content. And the content is this. We look at national and state sovereignty, which is a legal response. We look at the United Nations, which is another legal response. International instruments, which is legal. Courts and tribunals, also legal. Intergovernmental organisations, which is mostly legal but are also non-legal measures as well. And then we also look at the use of force, which is legal. However, then there are a whole bunch of non-legal measures, such as, I'm jumping ahead of myself, the Australian federal government, which is also a legal measure. There are a whole range of non-legal measures in resolving conflict and working towards world order, and that is non-government organisations, the media, political negotiation, and persuasion. Now, by looking at all of this content, this is all the content that we need to cover. You're able to evaluate the effectiveness of legal and non-legal, examine the role of sovereignty in assisting and impeding, and also look at the role of the Australian federal government in responding to world order, which is down here. So let's dive straight into it. Okay, so national sovereignty in the nation state is all about the Treaty of Westphalia. Nations are free to pass laws internally and free to be the influence of other nations, established, as we've already seen, by Westphalia, and as already stated, of 1648. However, this concept is also upheld in Article 2.7 of the UN Charter. It also says that state sovereignty exists even to this day, pursuant to 2.7, Article 2.7. However, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the Security Council may impede or involve itself or overstretch interstate sovereignty to maintain peace and order. But the fundamental point now, that if we're working in this world where we have a whole bunch of individual nation states protected by state sovereignty who can pretty much do what they want, except in very limited circumstances, but generally Westphalia and 2.7 say that nations are pretty much as free as they wish. It means that nations really only join together if it's mutually beneficial to do so. This is the underlying dogma or mantra for world order. So it makes it difficult, though, for non-state entities. So people such as the Palestinians or the Kurds or the Catalonians in Spain, groups which are not represented by a nation, who don't like their government, who want their own government, but don't necessarily have someone to represent them, find it difficult to operate within this international system. So it's very good for nations. So people who are happy with the Australian government, enjoy being represented by them, it's an excellent system. But if you live in a system where you feel like the government doesn't represent you, such as the Palestinians, Kurds or Catalonians, then you have a real issue on your hands. Okay, let's move on. The United Nations is a legal response. It consists of the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the Secretariat, and the Economic and Social Council. There are 5 elements. Okay, so the General Assembly consists of 193 countries. That's where they debate issues and form policy, dissolve things peacefully and through discussion. The Security Council can authorise force, as mentioned above. It has 5 permanent members with the power of veto: Russia, China, UK, US, and France. And there are 10 rotating non-permanent members who get 2 years each. A recent example of their use is in resolution, I've had to put it up here, Resolution 1917, and that's where the Security Council authorised the use of force against the Libyan leader Gaddafi under the concept of responsibility to protect, but we'll come back to that later. The International Court of Justice provides non-binding advice. So its rulings, it's a court, but its rulings are non-binding. However, it's often written into treaties. 2 countries will decide we will trade this for that, and if there's any dispute, we will go to the ICJ to resolve that dispute. So it is only advice, but countries will often follow it, because if they never intended to follow it in the first place, they wouldn't bother including it in the treaty to begin with. But it's not actually. If a country does choose to ignore it, they can do so. Okay. An example of that recently, a recent thing was the Democratic Republic of Congo against Uganda, and that's where Ugandan forces were moving into the Congo and taking over territory in an unofficial way. And the court ruled in favour of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yeah. Okay, the Secretariat, that's responsible for the day-to-day running and the organising logistics of the UN. Its head is the Secretary General, which is Ban Ki-moon. Peacekeeping, like we organise the pay, the food, the equipment, the logistics of getting things on the ground. Also monitoring forces. UN has monitoring teams all over the world looking at human rights abuses or people compliance or non-compliance with treaties, and so they pay for that, they organise that. Lastly, the Economic and Social Council consists of 54 member countries, and this is designed to produce projects to improve the living conditions of people around the world, funds for farming projects, funds for sanitation, education projects. That's what they do. They try to improve the world. Let's move on. International instruments are another legal thing. These are treaties, protocols, declarations, agreements. They have many, many names. Anything where countries agree to do things together is an international instrument. They are non-binding. However, the mutual benefit encourages compliance. A country doesn't have to enter into one, so why would they enter into one that they're going to break? They'll only enter into one if they generally intend to stick to it. So it's roughly the amount countries generally follow the law. Overall, it's about the same that normal people follow domestic law. People do break domestic laws like murder and theft and all those terrible things, but some people do break it. About the same in international law. Most people follow it, some people do break it. Okay, examples of international instruments are HSC, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Montreal Treaty. There's literally thousands, but that's just 3 as a taster. Okay, there's a couple of important courts. The ICJ, mentioned above, part of the UN. The ICC, the International Criminal Court. We have a couple of tribunals as well. The International Tribunal of Rwanda and the International Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. Okay, so let's just skip over the ICJ because we've done that. We'll go to the ICC. It was established under the Rome Statute of 1998. It deals with crimes against the international community, things such as genocide and war crimes. It's important that it prosecutes individuals, whereas the ICJ deals with states, issues between 2 countries, like we have here, the DRC and Uganda. This will prosecute a particular individual. So here's an example of that. The prosecutor versus Thomas Diallo of 2006. He was using child soldiers in the Congo, and that's obviously a form of war crime, and therefore he was convicted by the ICC. Okay, these 2 down here, these tribunals, they're temporary. The international community is very worried about having their state sovereignty curbed, so they are always hesitant to produce these big courts so we can start ordering countries around. So a tribunal is very convenient because we can set it up to deal with a particular issue. As soon as that issue is resolved, we can dissolve it. So we can dissolve it after use. It's not kicking around, still ordering countries around, which they don't like. And it keeps state sovereignty intact. Countries, its state sovereignty will be, as soon as it's dissolved, state sovereignty returns to normal. And they prosecute war criminals. We've had a look in class at Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. Please brush up on that if you're not sure what that's about. Okay, let's have a look very quickly, moving down to intergovernmental organisations. That's where governments choose to work together. So a really good example of that is the European Union and the World Health Organization. There are many, many others. In fact, in the notes we deal with others. So the EU is all about encouraging cooperation through membership. What they do is if you join, you have to have economic, human rights and political cooperation between all member states. Now this can be useful because it's very beneficial to be part of the EU, well depending on what happened to Greece, but it can be very beneficial being part of the EU. So countries will make economic, human rights and political reforms, change themselves in order to be in this intergovernmental organisation. And that gives the European Union huge powers. Countries don't have to join, they still have their state sovereignty, but if they want to join and get all the benefits, the mutual benefit, then they have to make certain changes, and that gives the EU some power, which is entirely a legal thing. Yeah, so here it's got legal and non-legal. But this World Health Organization is probably more non-legal. It's made up of 50 members, and they more like fund health initiatives in response to health crises such as Ebola and things like that. So this is non-legal. They go in there and specifically try to help things, help the world plan for like outbreaks of viruses or terrible conditions that people live in. Okay, let's have a look down here at the use of force. There are three ways that we can have use of force which are legal. First of all, the UN Security Council can authorize force, self-defense can be used, and also responsibility to protect is the third way that the use of force can be legal. Any other use of force outside of that is illegal. So under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the UN Security Council can authorize force in order to maintain peace and security throughout the world. Countries under Article 51 of the UN Charter are also able to use force if they are responding to force. So if somebody threatens them militarily, then you're legally allowed to use force in response. Finally, responsibility to protect is about this concept coming out of the failure of the world to respond to Rwanda, that all nations actually have a responsibility to protect individuals who aren't being protected by their own governments. However, at the moment, the concept is still slightly limited because it still needs UN Security Council to sign off on it for it to be legal. We talk about more of that in the next section. All right, quickly moving on, we're talking about the Australian federal government and its responses to world order, which is entirely a legal issue. So under the external affairs power of section 51, part 29 of the Australian Constitution, that's where we find the external affairs power, the Australian government is allowed to sign treaties. It's legally allowed to do it. However, because we have a dual list system, that needs to be passed into domestic law before it takes any effect. But this creates a question, and it was dealt with a question regarding the separation of powers. What happens when the Australian government, so the federal government, signs a treaty in relation to education or relation to public transport, in relation to something that the states have responsibility for? Because under our constitution, the Australian government's only allowed to deal with its powers, and the states are left up to their own stuff. But what happens if the Australian government signs something that relates to a state area? Well, this happened in the Commonwealth and Tasmania case of 1983, referred to as the Tasmanian Dams case. Tasmania wanted to dam a World Heritage Site, or a very important environmental area, the Franklin River Dam, and the Commonwealth government said, no, you can't do that, we're going to pass a law that says you can't. And Tasmania said, sorry, government, this is not your area, this is a state issue, you can't do it. And the Commonwealth government said, but we've signed treaty in this area. We've signed treaty that said, we're going to protect all these native wildernesses. So they ran it off to the High Court, and the High Court came back and they said, actually, the federal powers will override state powers if they've signed an international instrument. It doesn't matter that they're strictly not allowed to pass laws in relation to national parks or these sorts of things under the Constitution, but if they sign treaty on it, then they are actually allowed to get involved. And so that dam was protected. It's an important case. So Australia's entered into a number of treaties, ANZUS 1952, more recently the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement 1914. Also, Australia is a good international citizen. We help out people. Australia gave $1 billion to Indonesia following the tsunami. Overall, we do give quite low levels of aid, but this was one standout case. It's important to note that's not all a good news story. Australia does do good. It does also do things it gets heavily criticised for. So the invasion assisted America in the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. It has a number of reports from the UN outlining, criticising the way that we treat refugees. And also the management of the Great Barrier Reef and also our greenhouse gas emissions frequently gets criticised by the UN. So it's a good and bad news story. We're not perfect. Okay, that brings us to these non-legal things up here. So let's dive into those really quickly. All right, so the first non-legal is non-government organisations. These are organisations which are set up to act in areas that governments cannot or will not act. One very prominent example of that is the International Committee of Red Cross and also Amnesty International. There are others in the notes that we talk about. So the International Committee of Red Cross, or the Red Cross, is all about meeting humanitarian needs. It provides food, medical support, sets up refugees camps. So it's entirely on its own, like it does its own thing. However, because of its status, it's been around for a long time, it's actually referenced in some treaties, such as the Geneva Convention, is given special status, almost some legal status. So while it's an NGO, it does have some backing from the international community, and governments will protect it if they feel that if the Red Cross is getting a hard time. It's sort of an unusual one. Amnesty International is entirely on its own. It works with governments but doesn't have support in treaty often. It goes out and investigates and reports human rights abuses. It produces reports which it gives to the media and promotes throughout the public to try and get the community to change its attitudes and get governments to act in certain ways. A good example of that is the Truth About Manus Island report in 2013, where it outlined some of the terrible conditions that refugees are subject to in Australia. Okay, moving on with the media now. Now we have Al Jazeera, clearly non-legal, and we have the ABC. There's many more. We deal with more in the notes, but these are good ones. So this, the Al Jazeera has whole sections devoted to human rights abuses, particularly focusing on Palestine, the occupied territories, which is very informative. Another key thing, it provides a non-Western perspective. A lot of the other media outlets, like Channel 7 or Channel 9 or NBC or the PBS, these American ones or British ones, have an Australian ones have a very Western view, whereas here through Al Jazeera we get a view from a Middle Eastern or a North African perspective, which is very interesting and helps us be more informed citizens. The ABC is Australian. We have great programs such as the ABC Four Corners and 7:30. Some classic examples of documentaries which have been significant is In the Shadows of Stadiums, which is all about the abuse of the poor treatment of Brazilians in the lead up to the last World Cup. That's out of order. Okay, let's move on. Political negotiation. There's more to come up here, but we'll move on. Political negotiation is all about is another non-legal thing. Political negotiation is about mutual interest. Essentially, countries are able to do as they please, but another country will offer another nation incentives to do the right thing. So country A says, we really want this to happen, but country B doesn't necessarily want it to do it. So what if we negotiate with them and we offer them things to make it more attractive? So Australia has a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that's got offices all over the world in different countries, and helps Australia communicate with other nations, the USA, Peru, any country Australia has one in. We can very quickly start communicating with the leadership what we want. So a recent example of that is Myron Sukumarandram and Andrew Chan, who smuggled 8.6 kilograms of heroin out of, people often get that confused, out of Indonesia to Australia. That was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald in February 2015. Australia negotiated with them on this. We didn't want them killed, even though they were. We offered to pay the imprisonment. If you keep them alive, we'll pay for all their jail costs for the rest of their lives. And also we put pressure and said, if you do this, we're going to withdraw our diplomat. Ultimately, they did kill Myron Sukumarandram and Andrew Chan, and we did withdraw our diplomat. However, we have since returned them. Okay, so let's talk about persuasion. We're moving on here. Sorry, these things are slightly out of whack. So persuasion is all about, is another legal measure, but it's all about putting pressure on other governments, economic pressure, political pressure, damaging the reputation of another country, really saying, yes, you can do what you want under state sovereignty, that's fine, but it's going to cost you economically, politically, we're going to make you unpopular throughout the world. So a really good example of that is the Guardian report in December 2013 of Russia supporting the sectarian, or the breakaway forces in Ukraine, the separatist forces in Ukraine. So the European Union and USA have been really active in this, trying to pressure Russia to stop that support. So they've stopped Russian banks operating in Europe. They refuse to buy and sell arms or technology with Russia. And also they've frozen the US bank accounts of senior Russian leaders. All of this stuff is, yeah, you've got your state sovereignty, Russia, and you can, really kind of do what you want. But if you're going to do that, we're really going to persuade you not to. We're going to, make it difficult for you to do business. Stop your arms dealing, make it difficult for you personally, the leaders. So that's what that's all about. This has gone on for a long time, but it was quite a complicated step. If you have any questions, leave them at the bottom.